So the graph view is probably the most important view inside of Substance Designer. This is where you'll be doing most of your work. This is where all the texturing process happens. This is where you're creating your full-on materials. This is where you're managing your nodes, you're connecting nodes, you're creating your outputs, and so on. The first thing I want to go over with you guys is how to get around inside of the graph view. The big one is just holding the middle mouse button, which is your scroll wheel, and you can actually pan around. And this is mostly how I get around, like in big graphs and things like that. You can also use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out as well. If you do not have a scroll wheel, or if you just don't like using the scroll wheel, you can also use the Control and Alt keys on the keyboard. So Control and right click does the panning, as I showed before, and Alt right click does a zoom in and out as well. So the next thing I want to show you is how to actually create your nodes inside of the graph view. Inside of Substance, there's actually 5 different ways of doing this. The first one I want to show you guys is actually right here on this top bar. You'll see a bunch of different icons. Each different icon represents a different commonly used node inside of Substance Designer. I'm not going to go over what each does, but just kind of hover over the name of what each one is. If you do, you could do a blend, you could do a blur. And again, you can hover over each one of these and it'll give you a brief description and name of what it is. The second way to add nodes is just right click inside of the graph view. And you can actually add the exact same ones that are actually up here inside of the top bar from previously. So we have the blends, the blurs, and all the ones that you see up here. Number 3, you can actually go inside of the library, go under filters, and type in whichever nodes you want to use. So again, we have the blends, and this one is more so about just kind of finding which one you're looking for by typing it in up here in the search bar. The other 2 methods I've showed you so far give you a kind of quicker way to look at your graphs in general. The fourth one, and my personal favorite, this is the way I personally work, is by pressing the space bar. It essentially is the exact same list that you get when you're doing the right click add node kind of hierarchy, but instead you can start typing away and looking up any existing nodes that are in Substance Designer. So we have, again, the blurs, the blends, sharpens, etc. One thing to note about if you're going to use the spacebar way of creating your nodes is you essentially have to know the name of the node that you want to bring in. It's a little less kind of visual as you see with these nodes from the top. I would say the exact same applies for the library because you're going to have to type in the actual name of the node that you're looking for. The fifth and final way to bring in a node is actually more dependent on the resources you have in. You can just bring in a resource from the Explorer bar and just drag it into the graph view. Now that we have a few nodes inside of our graph view, let's talk about how to connect nodes and their behaviors of connecting one another. So the first way to connect a node, you can actually bring in another node, say a blur, for instance. And this is pretty much the most basic way of connecting a node is you just left click on an output of a node and your mouse will start having this connection just follow the mouse. You don't actually have to hold the mouse. You can actually just move your mouse around inside the graph view and it'll always follow it. And you just do another click on the input that you'd like it to connect it to. So right here, we've created a single connection from a uniform color to a blur. Another way of doing this is let's just bring in another uniform color. Substance works from left to right most of the time. So we tend to create our graphs starting from the left and continuing on to the right. Another way to create another node is if you select your uniform color and use the spacebar method of creating a node. So let's see if we do a blur. It'll actually auto connect and continue that kind of left to right graph connections. So we can actually keep going from here and do, let's see, a sharpen, for example. And again, it keeps connecting from left to right, left to right. Now, if you want to start deleting nodes or breaking connections, there's also different ways of achieving that. You can first, the most easiest way is just selecting the actual connection and just hit the delete key on the keyboard, and that instantly breaks the connection. You can also just do a hover, which is my personal favorite, especially if things are getting super complicated and you're trying to select multiple things to delete. You can just hit the delete key. Um, Another way is actually just clicking on, say you want to break this connection, you can actually click on the blur and hit the delete key. What that does though is that it breaks the connection between the first and the last one, last node as well. So say you want to just get rid of this blur, but connect the uniform to the sharpen, you can actually click the middle node and just hit the backspace key on the keyboard. And that just gets rid of the single node that's in between. So let's connect this one over here. If we do that again, just hit the backspace, boom. Another cool trick with connections, especially if you have, say, a node with two inputs, for example, the blend node is a great example of this. If we connect two different nodes to this blend node, and say we like what's going on, but we kind of want to switch the foreground and background, we can actually just hover over both connections and hit the X on the keyboard, and that'll switch out the connections. So instead of having to say go back into this node, plug it in, and then go back into this node and plug it in, we can just easily select both connections and hit X to switch them out. You're probably going to run into this a few times when you're first learning Substance, but you're going to notice this red dot connection line. What you need to know about Substance Designer is that it works in RGB values and grayscale values. When you see a output connection that has this little yellow dot on it, that means it's an RGB node. Now, when you see a little gray dot on the output, that means it's a grayscale node. Now, when doing blends inside of Substance Designer, you're not really supposed to be able to blend an RGB with a grayscale. It just doesn't work. Two different ways to solve this problem are with two different nodes that you could bring in. So the first one is you can actually bring in a grayscale conversion. And what this does is you can see it wants you to input an RGB value and it'll output a grayscale value. So we can just easily do that with the uniform color. We'll just plug this into the grayscale, take the output and plug it into the blend, and boom, the connection error is gone. Another way we could fix this problem is if we do the opposite. We can actually take this grayscale value and turn it into RGB by bringing in a node called the gradient map node. So what this is essentially the opposite of what the grayscale conversion does. This takes a grayscale and turns it into an RGB. So if we just connect the gradient and then take this output, and then there you go. Another way not only to see it inside these little dots is also the color of the actual connections. So you'll notice that these grayscale values have connections that are gray, whereas these RGB nodes have connections that are yellow. Another type of connection that you might see while working is a thick or thin line connection. So right now you'll notice that these two lines are thick. So if I went to this uniform graph and just changed the output format to 16-bit, you'll instantly know that this thicker line, it means it's a 16-bit node, whereas this thinner line is an 8-bit node. Another way you can kind of see that is down here with the 16-bit and down here with the 8-bit. 16-bit just gives you a little bit more detail with your grayscale values and RGB values as well. Once you start getting more and more comfortable with Designer, your graphs are going to get more and more complex. Your nodes are going to be all over the place. They're going to be all jumbled, and at times it's going to be super messy. I want to go over a little bit of some of the ways to kind of tidy up your graphs and kind of keep them clean. This will make your life a lot easier if you follow these steps, because once you start getting to a super complicated graph, you'll know where everything is and you won't be jumbled trying to follow the connections to see where they go to. So the first one is more so about just aligning nodes together. So if you want to align these three sets of nodes either horizontally or vertically, you can do that. So if we just do a hover and select all the nodes that you'd like to align, you can actually just go to the very top over here. And at the very end, you'll notice we have this align the selected nodes horizontally or align the selected nodes vertically. So what we want to do is just we want to align them horizontally. So we can do that. Cool. And the same thing with the vertical. If we kind of have this one over here and we just want this one to be on top of here, we could just do the align vertical. And there you go. This one right here actually snaps the selected nodes on the grid. So say you're off the grid somehow, like not really, maybe like right here, you'll notice you can actually select all this and just do hit that. And now they're actually aligned onto the grid. So once they're on the grid, we can actually take these and do the exact same thing again, and then just move down. Another big one that I love to use inside of Designer is what we call frames. They're essentially big containers that can hold multiple nodes, and you can either color code them and add some little comments. That way you remember what kind of the combination of the nodes does or created. So to do this, we just do, again, another drag, and we just right click anywhere inside the graph, and you could do add frame. So instantly it adds this frame on here, and you could change the color by going over here to the right under the properties, and you can kind of go whatever color you want. The title, you can also change that as well. So, you could probably put in uniform color and add a little description if you want. Color changing. So the descriptor kind of just goes underneath a little bit. So you might have to move your nodes a little bit just in case it's a super long description. But from here, you can actually kind of change the size of the frame just by grabbing one of these edges and just left clicking and dragging to whatever you want to do. So if you want to enclose this one as well, you can actually just bring the frame upwards. And now that these nodes are in this frame, we can actually just grab this whole frame all together and just move it. And this moves all the nodes that are enclosed inside of this frame. So this is super useful for people who like to be super tidy. So once we have one frame here, you can continue to add more frames, give more descriptors, and so on. Now, if you'd like to use the descriptor without actually creating a frame, you can also do that as well. We just do the same thing. We do right click inside the graph, and instead of add a frame, we just want to add a comment. And instantly, so right now, because I had this node selected, it added the comment right underneath. But if I didn't have anything selected, it would just create it where my mouse is, and you can freely move it. And same thing, you can change the description, and you can kind of freely move it wherever you like and place it wherever you like as well. One last way to keep your graph nice and tidy is with navigation pins. Now, what navigation pins are kind of like bookmarks inside Substance Designer. You can drop a pin and you can instantly go back and forth between multiple pins. So to add one of these, you can just right click as you were with the add comments and add frames, but you do add pin, and you'll get this kind of little icon right here. What you can do from here, you can actually add a title and descriptor just like the frame, but you can keep adding more and more navigation pins. So we can add one here, add one here. So from here, say we're at this one and you want to cycle through the different pins that you've dropped, you can actually just hit the F2 key on the keyboard. And what this is like super helpful for like graphs that are really big and you're trying to remember certain areas of your graph that you'd like to go back and forth to. Some other general settings that you can do inside the graph view and kind of change the way you work are you can actually, if you don't like these smooth lines trying to connect nodes together, you can actually just hit this top bar, or sorry, this little icon right here called rectangular links. And what this does is it takes away the smooth connections that you have between nodes and gives you this rectangular look. You can also notice that the lines actually snap to some of the grid points inside of the graph view as well. Personally, I don't like really working like this, so I always just work in the smooth way. Another cool thing that you can do to kind of consolidate the amount of nodes you have is if you have a node, you can actually dock it into one another. So to do that, you just select the uniform color, or you select a node that is connected to something. So for example, this uniform color, you could hit the D on the keyboard and it'll start docking it. So you won't see it and it'll kind of condense the amount of nodes you have. And you can actually do this for multiple different ones. So if you hit D here, and it'll just kind of condense the amount of nodes you have and almost create like this row of docked nodes. And to undock them, you just select the node and hit D as well. The last thing I want to illustrate to you guys are the power of creating these graphs and using multiple graphs to create your substances. So for example, we inside this single graph, we have all these outputs. Say we've done a ton of work, we have a really awesome normal, a color and stuff like that. And we'd like to bring that into a different graph. So you could easily do that by doing a new substance, creating that. And this old graph that we did all these crazy changes to and all this work in, you can actually bring it into a new graph as a single node. So already that condenses all that kind of node network you have, all that information into a single node with some basic outputs. And this kind of shows you how powerful Substance can be if you've made a bunch of different nodes, graphs with like different materials, say like you have a sand, a dirt, and all that stuff. You can actually just bring in these full on materials and start blending them inside of the graph view. And that pretty much covers everything I have to show you guys for the graph view. So next up, we're going to go over the properties.